My name is Courtney. I'm 34. And up until last Thanksgiving, I kept most things about my life pretty private, especially when it came to money. Not because I was struggling or ashamed or anything like that, but because I've learned that in families like mine, the less they know, the less they can twist against you. I work as a freelance strategist, marketing, branding, copywriting for startups and indie businesses mostly. It's the kind of job that makes people tilt their head and ask, "So what do you actually do?" Especially people like my sister Caitlin. She's 36, works in corporate finance. And if you ever forgot that detail, don't worry. She'll remind you loudly and repeatedly, usually in front of an audience. Growing up in Louisville, Kentucky, Caitlin was the golden child. Honor roll varsity cheer internships handed to her on a silver platter. I, on the other hand, was the creative one. That was never meant as a compliment. It was what relatives said when I couldn't crunch numbers as fast as she could, or when I chose a degree in communications instead of business. At every family gathering, it felt like walking into a courtroom where my life choices were always on trial. My mom would start with the same question, "Still doing that freelance thing?" with the tone people usually reserve for something mildly embarrassing. I got used to it, or at least I thought I did. But last Thanksgiving, something shifted. And it wasn't just the usual subtle digs. It turned into something else entirely. At Thanksgiving dinner, my sister bragged about her six-figure salary and mocked me as an unknown freelancer in front of our parents and everyone else. When a phone was accidentally left open revealing my husband's and my tax returns showing I earned 3 times as much as she did, she was left stunned and speechless. She hasn't spoken to me since that day. If you're ready to hear how quiet success turned into the biggest family fallout I've ever seen, stick around. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happened next. Let's get into it. Thanksgiving that year arrived with the usual crisp Kentucky air and the smell of Mom's turkey roasting since dawn. Their house in Louisville's Highlands neighborhood was full by early afternoon relatives, spilling into the living room, football blaring on the big screen, kids chasing each other around the couch, and the dining table already set with the good china and cranberry sauce in little crystal dishes. Everyone brought something: green bean casserole from an Aunt Pie's, from a cousin, and wine that Dad had carefully selected from his collection. It was the kind of gathering that felt warm and familiar on the surface, but underneath carried the familiar undercurrent of comparison that had followed me my whole life. Matthew and I arrived around 3 arms loaded with side dishes and a bottle of Pinot Noir. He gave Mom a quick hug while I helped Dad set up extra chairs, and we settled into the routine small talk about the weather, the Titans game, and how the traffic on I-64 had been brutal. Caitlin and Derek showed up a little later, as always. Fashionably delayed Caitlin in a sharp burgundy sweater that screamed, "I just came from the office," even though it was a holiday. She swept in with that confident stride, kissing Mom on the cheek and immediately launching into how the firm had just closed a massive quarter. We all gathered at the table by 6, the room filled with clinking silverware and overlapping conversations, but Caitlin's voice cut through everything. She raised her glass during the toast, smiling that polished smile she saves for these moments. "I'm just so grateful this year," she said, her tone warm but pointed. "For family, for health, and for real stability in this economy. Not everyone can say they pulled in a solid 6-figure salary with bonuses on top, while the rest of the world scrambles." Her eyes flicked toward me for half a second, subtle enough that most people might miss it, but I didn't. The table gave the usual polite chuckles. Mom patted her arm and murmured how proud she was. Dad nodded approvingly, and Derek chimed in with a laugh about how tough the market had been, but "we're still crushing it." Then Caitlin turned directly to me, fork hovering over her plate. "So, Courtney's still doing that freelance thing, working in your pajamas whenever you feel like it. Must be nice to have that kind of freedom. No real deadlines. No boss breathing down your neck." She said it lightly like a joke everyone was in on, but the room quieted just enough to make it land heavier than intended. I felt Matthew's hand brush mine under the table, a silent, "Don't bite." And I kept my voice even. "It's going well," I said. "Busier, actually." Caitlin raised an eyebrow, that familiar smirk tugging at her mouth. "Busy in a good way, I hope. I mean, it's cute that you can make it work without a steady paycheck, but I'd have ulcers if I didn't know exactly what was coming in every month. Stability matters, you know? Especially when you're building something real." Derek nodded along, adding his own little dig about how real corporate life keeps you grounded. The conversation moved on after that. Someone asked about the kids' school. Someone else complimented the gravy, but the air had shifted. I focused on my plate, letting the moment pass while Caitlin basked in the attention she always seemed to command at these dinners. Later, as dessert plates were being cleared and people migrated toward coffee in the living room, Brittany, my best friend who'd been invited as family, grabbed her phone to show Mom a photo of her new puppy. She set it down on the side table to help with the dishes screen still on. A minute later, Caitlin walked past, coffee in hand, and paused. Her expression changed, first confusion, then a slow widening of the eyes as she glanced down at the open PDF. It was the income summary from my CPA, the one I'd forwarded to Matthew earlier that week to double-check a deduction. The numbers were right there, bold and clear, my freelance earnings for the year more than triple what Caitlin had just bragged about. She stared for a long beat, mouth slightly open, the mug forgotten in her hand. No outburst, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet, stunned silence that swallowed the rest of the evening. She set the phone down carefully, turned away without a word, and spent the rest of the night on the far side of the room talking to anyone but me. By the time Matthew and I said our goodbyes and stepped out into the cool night air, the damage was done. Caitlin didn't hug me farewell. She didn't even look in my direction. The drive home was quiet, but I could already feel the shift coming, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but loaded. The rest of the evening unfolded in an eerie hush that no one else seemed to notice at first. Caitlin stayed on the opposite side of the living room, sipping her coffee with mechanical precision, while the family chatted about holiday plans and the upcoming Christmas lights display downtown. She answered questions when spoken to, offered a tight smile to Mom when asked if she wanted more pie, but her usual animated gestures had vanished. Every time I glanced over, she was looking anywhere but at me, her posture rigid as if holding herself together by sheer will. Matthew noticed too. He leaned in during a lull and murmured that we should probably head out soon, and I agreed without hesitation. As we gathered our coats and said our goodbyes, Caitlin remained seated on the couch, scrolling through her phone with exaggerated focus. Mom hugged me goodbye and whispered that it had been a lovely evening, oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. Dad clapped Matthew on the shoulder and told us to drive safe, while the rest of the relatives waved from their spots around the room. Caitlin didn't stand up. She didn't walk us to the door. She simply lifted her hand in a half-hearted wave from across the space, eyes fixed on her screen. The drive home felt longer than usual. Matthew kept the radio low, giving me room to process what had just happened. I replayed the moment in my head, the way her face had drained of color when she saw the numbers, the slow blink as realization hit, the immediate retreat into silence. It wasn't anger that had taken over. It was something colder, more calculated. By the time we pulled into our driveway, the first flakes of snow were starting to fall, and I realized Caitlin hadn't texted me goodnight like she sometimes did after family dinners. The next morning brought nothing. No group chat message checking if everyone got home okay, no private text asking if I was free for coffee later in the week. I waited through breakfast, through a client call, through the quiet afternoon when Matthew went for a run. Still nothing. By evening, the absence felt deliberate. I checked our family thread. Everyone else had shared photos from the night before, laughing emojis, and thanks to Mom for the meal, but Caitlin's name stayed silent. No likes, no replies. Days turned into a week, and the pattern solidified. Thanksgiving had always been the unofficial kickoff to the holiday season in our family, the one time everyone made an effort to connect before the Christmas rush. Normally, Caitlin would be the first to organize a cookie baking day or suggest a gift exchange idea, but this year she vanished from the conversation. Mom mentioned in passing that Caitlin had been super busy at work, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. Dad didn't comment at all. I didn't reach out. Part of me wanted to text and ask what was wrong to break the ice the way I always had in the past, but something held me back. The silence wasn't just absence, it was a choice. Caitlin had seen the truth, and instead of processing it privately or even confronting me, she had chosen to erase me from her orbit. No angry messages, no passive-aggressive memes in the group chat, just a clean, total cutoff. Matthew and I talked about it over dinner one night. He pointed out that she might need time, that the shock of seeing those numbers could have hit harder than anyone expected. I nodded, but deep down, I knew this wasn't temporary. Caitlin had built her identity around being the successful one, the stable one, the one everyone looked to for advice on careers and finances. In one accidental glimpse, that foundation had cracked, and rather than repair it, she withdrew completely. By the end of the week, the family chat had quieted too. No one seemed eager to fill the void she had left. I kept my routine going: client meetings, revisions, walks around the neighborhood with Matthew. The holiday lights started going up on the streets of Louisville and life moved forward, but the space where Caitlin used to be remained empty. She didn't call on my birthday the following month. She didn't send a single message. The silence stretched on, and with every passing day, it became clearer that this wasn't a pause. It was the new normal. A few weeks after Thanksgiving, the silence from Caitlin had become impossible to ignore. The family chat that used to buzz with holiday memes and recipe ideas had gone quiet in her corner, but then the subtle shifts started appearing. One evening, Mom sent a message asking if I was still planning to host Christmas Eve, and Caitlin replied with a simple, "busy at work" emoji, short, neutral, but noticeably absent from any follow-up conversation. The first real sign came during a casual call from Mom. She sounded hesitant as she asked how things were going with my clients, then paused before adding that Caitlin had mentioned something about freelance work being unpredictable these days. "She just worries about you, honey," Mom said, her voice trailing off as if she wasn't entirely convinced. I kept my response light, saying everything was fine, but the seed had been planted. Dad followed up a couple days later with a text asking if I had considered looking into more stable opportunities, the kind of question he never asked before Caitlin's influence started showing. Then the group chat began to change. It started small. Someone shared an article about online scams targeting small businesses, and Caitlin reacted with a thinking face emoji. A few days later, another link appeared about freelancers getting audited for tax issues, posted without comment, but timed perfectly after a conversation about year-end finances. No one tagged me, but the implication hung there like fog. Derek even chimed in once with a laughing emoji and, "This is why we love our W-2 life," which felt targeted even if it wasn't direct. The pattern was clear, indirect jabs that painted freelance as risky or questionable, all while Caitlin stayed mostly silent in the thread. That's when my cousin Taylor reached out privately. She texted me late one night saying she needed to give me a heads up. Taylor had always been the neutral one in family matters, close enough to everyone but never taking sides. She explained that Caitlin had been venting to her and a couple other relatives about how my sudden success seemed suspicious, that no one goes from barely scraping by to high earnings without something shady going on. Taylor sounded uncomfortable relaying it, adding that Caitlin had even suggested my income reports might not hold up under scrutiny. "I don't believe it," Taylor wrote, "but I thought you should know before it spreads further." The next weekend, Mom called again, this time more directly. She wanted to know if everything was okay financially, if I had all my paperwork in order. Caitlin just mentioned she heard some freelancers run into trouble with the IRS. Mom said, her tone apologetic but probing. Dad joined the call midway and asked if I had a good accountant, the kind of concern that felt more like doubt than support. I answered calmly, explaining that my CPA handled everything and taxes were filed properly, but the conversation left a sour taste. They didn't push hard, but the hesitation in their voices told me the rumors were taking root. I didn't respond in the group chat or confront Caitlin directly. Instead, I watched the dynamic shift quietly. Relatives who used to ask about my projects now steered conversations away from work when I was mentioned. The usual holiday planning messages slowed down, and when they did appear, Caitlin's replies were brief or non-existent. It was all so understated, nothing explosive, just a slow erosion of trust that made every interaction feel weighted. Matthew and I discussed it over coffee one morning. He suggested waiting it out, that people would eventually see through the insinuations, but I could sense the frustration building. The rumors weren't loud accusations. They were whispers designed to linger, to make doubt the default. By the end of the month, the family dynamic had tilted noticeably. Mom still sent photos of her garden and asked about our plans, but her messages carried an undercurrent of caution. Dad's check-ins felt more like fact-finding than casual concern. The quiet campaign was effective in its subtlety. Caitlin had turned her shock into a narrative that protected her position, and it was spreading without her ever having to say my name outright. I kept my head down, focused on work, and reminded myself that truth has a way of surfacing eventually. For now, though, the whispers were enough to make the holidays feel colder than the Louisville winter outside. February brought Dad's 65th birthday, and the family decided to celebrate at a nice steakhouse downtown Louisville, with dark wood paneling, soft lighting, and a private room overlooking the Ohio River. Mom had booked it months in advance, insisting on a slideshow of old photos and a cake from the bakery Dad liked best. The turnout was solid. Aunts, uncles, a few cousins, and of course Caitlin and Derek, who arrived right on time, for once Caitlin, in a tailored blazer that looked more boardroom than birthday. We took our seats around the long table as servers brought out appetizers and wine. Conversation flowed easily at first, stories about Dad's early career, jokes about his obsession with perfect golf swings, but the undercurrent from the past months lingered. Caitlin sat across from me, chatting animatedly with relatives about her latest project at the firm, her laughter a little too bright. She hadn't spoken to me directly since Thanksgiving, but tonight she maintained the appearance of normalcy, nodding politely when someone addressed the group. After the main course, Dad stood to thank everyone, and Chelsea, his wife, dimmed the lights for the slideshow. Photos flashed by Dad as a young man, family vacations, birthdays over the years. Laughter rippled through the room with each goofy shot. When it ended, Caitlin asked to say a few words. She stood smoothly, glass in hand, and began with a warm smile toward Dad. "I'm so proud of you, Dad," she said, voice steady and clear. 65 years of hard work providing for your family, setting the example of what it means to have a real career. Stability, commitment, showing up every day, that's what lasts. Not the trendy online gigs or quick fixes that come and go with the latest fad. Her gaze swept the table, lingering just long enough on me to make the point unmistakable. "We're lucky to have that kind of foundation." The room responded with applause and nods. Mom smiled proudly. Dad raised his glass in thanks, and Derek clapped enthusiastically. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest but kept my expression neutral. Matthew squeezed my knee under the table, a silent anchor. The evening wound down with cake and coffee. As people started gathering coats, I caught Caitlin heading toward the hallway near the restrooms. I followed, waiting until the corridor was empty before speaking. "Caitlin," I said quietly. She stopped, turned her face a mask of composure. "What?" she replied, tone flat. I kept my voice low. "The comments tonight? The ones about real careers and trendy online gigs. That was aimed at me." She crossed her arms. "It was a general toast to Dad. Don't make it about you." "It felt personal," I continued, "especially after Thanksgiving. You've been quiet since then, Too quiet, and now this. If you have something to say it directly. Caitlin glanced down the hall to make sure no one was coming, then met my eyes. Fine. You want direct? I saw those numbers. I know what you claim to make. But things like that don't just happen without questions. People talk. They wonder how someone with no steady job pulls in that much. I was just stating facts about what real work looks like. Real work, I echoed. I've built my business from scratch: contracts, clients, taxes filed on time. If you're spreading doubts to mom and dad, that's not protecting them. That's undermining me. She shifted her weight, the first crack in her calm. I'm not spreading anything. I'm just being honest with family. You kept it hidden for years. Now suddenly, you're the big earner. It raises questions. It raises questions because you can't accept that I succeeded differently, I said. But if you're going to imply I'm doing something wrong, at least have the courage to say it to my face instead of through speeches and whispers. Caitlin's jaw tightened. For a moment, her eyes flickered with something like uncertainty, maybe even fear that the narrative was slipping. You don't get it, she said finally. This isn't about you. It's about Dad, about what he built. She turned and walked back toward the dining room without another word. I stayed in the hallway for a minute, letting the adrenaline settle. Matthew found me soon after, and we left without fanfare. The drive home was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, charged with the knowledge that Caitlin's mask had slipped just enough to show the worry underneath. Several months after Dad's birthday, the consequences started showing up in my professional life. One morning, during a routine video call with a long-term client, an e-commerce brand based in Chicago, the account manager brought up a concern that caught me off guard. We've heard some chatter, she said carefully, about potential irregularities in freelance operations. Nothing official, just industry gossip. We trust you, but wanted to check in since we're scaling up, and compliance is key right now. Her tone was professional and neutral, but the question lingered like a shadow over the rest of the discussion. I assured her my records were clean, explained the process I followed with my CPA, and offered to send updated contracts for review. She thanked me, and we moved on, but the seed of doubt had been planted externally for the first time. A similar conversation happened a week later with another client, a tech startup in Austin. Their founder mentioned hearing from a mutual connection that freelance earnings like mine sometimes raised red flags with the IRS. We don't believe it, he added quickly, but it's out there. Just making sure everything's solid on your end. I responded the same way: calm explanation, full transparency, and an offer to provide documentation. Both clients stayed on, but the inquiries signaled that the rumors had escaped the family circle and reached professional networks where reputation directly affects contracts. That evening, Brittany came over for dinner and I filled her in on the calls. She listened intently, then set her fork down. This isn't staying in the family anymore, she said. If it's hitting your clients, it's crossing a line. You can't just let it spread. You need to protect what you've built, start documenting everything, and consider making your work more visible so people see the legitimacy for themselves. Brittany had always been direct but supportive, and her words cut through the fog. She suggested I review my online presence, add case studies to my site, and reach out proactively to key contacts to reinforce trust. Don't attack anyone, she advised. Just show the facts. People respect transparency. I took her advice seriously. The next day, I began a quiet audit of my digital footprint. I pulled together screenshots of client testimonials, payment records, and project deliverables. Then, I dug into the origins of the rumors more methodically. Using basic tools, I tracked mentions of my name in industry forums and LinkedIn comments, where questions about freelance legitimacy had popped up anonymously. One pattern stood out: several accounts created within a short window had posted similar doubts, and when I checked the IP traces through a simple analytics review, they pointed to a subnet associated with Caitlin's firm in Louisville. It wasn't conclusive proof of her direct involvement, but the timing and location aligned too closely to ignore. I compiled everything timestamps, logs, and screenshots into a private folder without jumping to conclusions. Matthew helped organize the files and reminded me to stay focused on defense, not retaliation. "This is about protecting your business," he said, "not settling scores." I agreed. Instead of confronting Caitlin again, I prioritized rebuilding visibility. I updated my portfolio site with detailed case studies, added a section on my process and compliance, and reached out to a few past clients for fresh testimonials. Each step was deliberate and low-key, designed to counter doubt, with evidence rather than emotion. The work paid off gradually. One client who had hesitated on a new project renewed after reviewing the updated materials, and another sent a note saying the transparency helped quiet their concerns. I avoided any public response to the whispers, knowing that engaging would only amplify them. Brittany checked in regularly, offering encouragement and reminding me that facts had a way of cutting through noise when given the chance. By late spring, the professional pressure had eased somewhat, though the awareness remained. I had documented enough to feel secure if anything escalated, but I also knew the source hadn't stopped. The rumors had shifted from family whispers to subtle professional erosion, and addressing them required steady, consistent effort. I continued focusing on the work delivering results and letting the quality speak for itself, while the evidence sat ready in case it was ever needed. By early summer, the need to set boundaries had become unavoidable. After the client conversations and the steady drip of doubt that followed, I decided it was time to address the source directly without escalation. I drafted an email to Caitlin one quiet afternoon, sitting at my desk with the window open to the warm Louisville breeze. The message was formal but personal. No legal threats, just clear language explaining that I had become aware of ongoing comments, questioning my business practices, and asking her to stop sharing or implying anything inaccurate about my work. I attached a brief summary of my tax filings for the past 2 years, along with a list of current contracts to demonstrate legitimacy. The tone stayed professional. "If there's any concern, I'd prefer we discuss it openly rather than through others." I hit send and then stepped away from the computer for the rest of the day. Caitlin didn't reply immediately. In fact, she didn't reply at all. But the absence of response felt different this time, less like deliberate silence, and more like someone who had been put on notice. I didn't follow up. The email was enough to create a record if needed, and it gave me the clarity I required to move forward. The next step was transparency with my parents. I compiled a folder of documents, complete tax returns for the last 3 years, detailed client contracts, payment confirmations, and a simple breakdown of my business structure, including how income was reported and expenses tracked. I wrote a short cover note to Mom and Dad explaining that I wanted them to have the full picture, since questions had been raised about my financial stability. "These are the facts," I wrote. "Everything is above board, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have directly." I attached the files and sent the email to both of them together, knowing they would review it privately. Their reaction came slowly. Mom called a few days later, her voice softer than usual. She said she and Dad had gone through the documents and were surprised by the numbers. "We had no idea it was this substantial," she admitted. There was a pause. Then she added that Caitlin had painted a different picture, one where my success seemed questionable or temporary. Mom sounded conflicted, as if the evidence in front of her was forcing her to reconsider assumptions she had held for years. Dad got on the line briefly and said he appreciated the clarity, adding that he wished he had asked sooner. Neither of them accused Caitlin outright, but the shift was noticeable. Their questions now carried a hint of doubt directed toward her narrative rather than mine. The family dynamic began to adjust in small ways. Mom started including me in more everyday messages, pictures of her garden updates on Dad's golf game, and her tone lost the subtle caution it had carried since the rumors began. Dad sent a separate text thanking me for the documents and mentioning he had spoken with Caitlin about the importance of accurate information. He didn't elaborate, But the message implied a conversation had taken place. Relatives who had grown distant started responding more warmly, and a few even asked genuine questions about my projects without the undertone of skepticism. Matthew watched the changes with quiet satisfaction. He reminded me that facts had a way of reshaping perceptions when presented calmly and consistently. Brittany checked in as well, praising the approach for its restraint. "You didn't lash out," she said. "You just laid everything out. That's powerful." I knew they were right. The process hadn't been about winning an argument, but about reclaiming control of my own story. By sharing the evidence without accusation, I had shifted the focus from speculation to reality. Caitlin remained distant, but the silence now felt strained rather than absolute. She didn't engage in the family chat the way she used to, and when she did, her responses were brief. Mom mentioned in passing that Caitlin seemed preoccupied with work, but there was a new layer to her words, a recognition that the story Caitlin had been telling didn't fully align with the documents they had seen. Dad's mentions of her were similarly measured, as if he was weighing both sides for the first time. The summer progressed with a gradual rebalancing. I continued my work delivering projects and nurturing client relationships, while the family slowly adjusted to the new information. Mom and Dad began treating my updates with the same interest they gave Caitlin's, and the questions about my stability faded entirely. It wasn't dramatic reconciliation, but a quiet correction of perspective, one document at a time. The defense had worked not through confrontation, but through clarity, and for the first time in months, I felt the ground under me steady again. Late summer turned into fall, and the consequences that had been building finally surfaced in ways no one could ignore. Whispers from the family had gradually made their way into professional circles and eventually reached Caitlin's firm through indirect channels. Someone in her network heard the same doubts that had circulated earlier and raised a concern internally about potential misuse of company resources in personal matters. The compliance team launched a routine review triggered by those reports, examining email logs, IP activity, and external communications. Caitlin was placed on administrative leave, while the investigation proceeded a standard procedure in finance when questions about integrity arise. The outcome came swiftly by mid-autumn. Caitlin lost the vice president promotion she had been positioning for the role, went to someone else with a cleaner record. Faced with the likelihood of further scrutiny, she chose to resign quietly, accepting a severance package to avoid any public record of the findings. The firm never announced details, but the sudden departure spoke volumes in an industry where perception is currency. She had always prided herself on being the stable, reliable professional, and now that image had cracked irreparably. Her marriage to Derek followed a similar path. The stress of the job loss, the family tension, and the constant strain of maintaining appearances proved too much. By early winter, Derek moved out, and they began separation proceedings. He cited irreconcilable differences in court documents, but those close to them knew the real pressure had come from the fallout that started at Thanksgiving. Caitlin eventually relocated to a smaller city in Tennessee just across the border, where she took a lower-level position at a regional bank. The move was practical, lower cost of living new start, but it marked the end of her prominent role in Louisville's professional and social circles. For my part, I made the decision to go no contact permanently. I blocked Caitlin on all platforms, removed her from family group chats, and stopped accepting invitations that included her. Holidays passed without her presence, and I no longer felt the pull to bridge the gap. Mom and Dad respected the boundary, though they occasionally mentioned missing the old family dynamic. They had come to understand the full picture after reviewing the documents and their own conversations with Caitlin. They didn't push for reconciliation, instead, choosing to maintain separate relationships with each of us. My business, meanwhile, continued to grow. The transparency I had embraced attracted more clients who valued straightforwardness, and I expanded into larger projects with international reach. Matthew and I invested in a small cabin outside Louisville where we spent weekends away from the noise. Life settled into a quieter rhythm, one free from the comparisons and expectations that had defined family gatherings for so long. Looking back, the entire situation taught a hard but valuable lesson. Quiet success can unsettle those who measure worth by visibility, and when insecurity turns into doubt, it spreads like a slow poison. The real damage isn't in the differences between paths, but in the refusal to accept them without malice. Protecting your own peace sometimes means stepping away completely, even from blood. Truth doesn't need to shout, it simply exists, and when given space, it corrects the record on its own terms. To everyone who stayed with this story until the end, thank you for listening. It means a lot that you took the time to hear how one moment of revelation unraveled years of assumptions. Family dynamics are complicated and painful, but they also show us what boundaries look like when respect is no longer mutual. If this resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how you've navigated similar situations or what lessons you've learned along the way. Take care out there.